Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The Keys to Successful Production, Processing, and Delivery of HDR Content. I'm Ruben Cohn, your moderator for today's discussion. Today, I have with me Rob Cadzo, and we're going to be talking about HDR solutions. How are you doing today, Rob?
I'm doing good. Thanks, Ruben.
Outstanding. So let's get started. So tell me, Vantage 8 supports HDR, correct?
So yes, Vantage 8 supports HDR. This includes support for all popular HDR formats, advanced HDR color management and conversion, HDR metadata insertion and extraction, and of course, QC and analysis of HDR content.
All right, so it looks like Vantage has some comprehensive HDR support. And I know folks in the audience know what HDR is because they signed up for this webinar. But maybe you could go through and explain a little bit about what HDR is, and then we'll get into why it's important.
Sure. HDR obviously stands for high dynamic range, and dynamic range is really just the range of lightness to darkness in an image or system. High dynamic range just has much greater range than what we can refer to as SDR, or standard dynamic range. This slide illustrates the difference in luminance, or nits, which is simply a measurement for brightness between HDR and SDR. SDR displays are generally capable of around 100 nits, while HDR displays can be up to 10,000 nits. HDR isn't just about brightness. It also supports a much wider, richer color gamut. In this slide, you can see the CIE 1931 color space diagram. The smallest triangle in the middle of the diagram represents the Rec 709 color gamut. The solid triangle on the outside of that represents the DCI, or Digital Cinema, Key 3 gamut. And finally, the largest triangle on the very outside represents the Rec 2020 color gamut. HDR is necessary to accurately represent high contrast images. In this image, you can see HDR is necessary to accurately reproduce both the luminance and color of the subject. In this image, HDR is required to reproduce both the very bright yellow and also the very dark blacks. As you can see here, the yellow parts of the image are up to 14,000 nits, while the darkest parts of the image are down at 145 nits.
And so in a normal display, you simply can't get all that information, right? You have to lose something.
Correct. And in this image, we'll see a comparison between SDR on the left and HDR on the right. As you can see on the left, there is virtually no detail in the snow. It's all been lost. If you look at the image on the right, you will see that we've maintained all the detail. So HDR is not only necessary to reproduce color and luminance levels properly, but also to retain the image data
Rob,
itself.
thanks. That's a great overview. So let's talk about some of the individual HDR formats, because I know there are a bunch of them.
With HDR, not one format fits all. There are a number of different formats, each with their own strengths and suitable for different types of production. HLG, which you've probably heard of, which is created by the BBC and NHK, is one of the more popular ones. And it's very popular in sports and live broadcasts because it has no dynamic metadata, and is also compatible with SDR TVs or displays. And what that means is if I take a look at an HLG image on a normal SDR display, it looks reasonable. It doesn't look bad. And that is just simply not the case with other HDR formats. For other HDR formats, you must have a display that supports that particular format. HDR10 is also very popular. The industry standard for a lot of episodic and feature content, and it uses static metadata. And we'll get into a little bit about the difference between static and dynamic metadata here in a minute. Dolby Vision is another format that's supported in Vantage. Dolby Vision is very common on VOD and OTT platforms like Netflix, and it uses proprietary Dolby technology with dynamic metadata. What dynamic metadata means is, unlike HDR10 or HLG, where one set of image metadata is applied to the entire program, with Dolby Vision, each scene or shot can have differing metadata. HDR10 Plus is an open source HDR format that was developed by Samsung, and much like Dolby Vision, uses dynamic metadata. Another format is known as Advanced HDR by Technicolor. Advanced HDR by Technicolor uses HLG with dynamic metadata. To work with HDR, you must have support for high bit depth, high resolution, and high frame rate codecs, such as ProRes HQ, JPEG 2000, and HEVC. The Vantage Video Processing Library, or VPL, is extremely accurate, up to 16 bits of accuracy, to allow for very high quality conversions between any of these formats. Vantage can also package these outputs in industry standard formats such as IMF, DCP, or HLS for adaptive bit rates.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about different scenarios when one needs to convert from or to HDR and how that works.
Sure. So Vantage supports all sorts of color space conversion, along with conversions from different gammas or transfer functions using different color primaries with different ranges or bit depths. So as you can see here, we support SDR to HDR up conversions, HDR to SDR down conversions, and cross conversions between different HDR color spaces, transfer functions, and gamuts. So the Vantage Color Space Converter enables HDR workflows by allowing translation between various color space gamut, such as Rec 709, P3, and Rec 2020. As I mentioned, using various transfer functions, such as PQ or ST2084, Rec 709, HLG, etc. We also support up to 16 bits of accuracy utilizing the Vantage VPL. So all of our conversions are very high quality, utilizing the same VPL that's always been in Vantage. Unlike everything in Vantage, these conversions, which are very complex, as you can see, with different input color primaries, different transfer functions, different color matrices, all of these can be automated dynamically and also driven via the Vantage API. So unlike a lot of color management tools, Vantage is easily automated for large-scale processing and conversion. Color conversions are also subjective, or can be subjective, in that the needs may differ based on project, region, format, and just customer preference. So for these instances, when the default mathematical conversions in the Vantage color space filter aren't quite good enough, or just don't suit the customer needs, we have the Vantage lookup table, or LUT filter. The Vantage LUT filter supports industry standard LUT formats, such as the .cube format and the .3DL format. The Vantage Color Tools also integrate nicely with all of the industry standard color management and color correction tools like DaVinci Resolve and ColorFront Transcoder. A good example of this, for this year's Super Bowl, Fox Sports utilized Vantage to deliver not only the HDR content, but also the down-converted SDR version. While the default HLD to Rec 709 conversions are acceptable and look great, Fox Sports colorists developed a proprietary SDR LUT, which they preferred, and this was applied to all content during the conversion to Rec 709. Oh, and hey, by the way, Ruben, did I mention that all the Vantage HDR tools can run on-prem on your Vantage system or in the cloud?
They can run in the cloud. That is fantastic.
Just a right click away. For this year's Super Bowl, Fox Sports utilized Vantage to deliver not only their HDR content, but also to deliver SDR down-converted versions. For this particular project, even though the HLG conversion to Rec 709 looked fine, the Fox colorists have their own SDR LUTs that they prefer to use. So in this workflow, you'll see an example of how they did that. So we're using our color space filter to let Vantage know what it's to expect, and then we're applying a custom LUT that was developed by the colorists at Fox Sports for their SDR content. And you'll see here, we're expecting a 2020 input. We're expecting an HLG transfer function. The range is full range. We're going to output a Rec 709 with a 709 transfer function at video or studio range.
That's great, Rob. So this obviously gives the user creative control upstream from Vantage, but they can still use Vantage in this critical piece of their HDR conversion workflow. So that's really powerful.
That's correct. And they could expect the outputs that they're used to seeing in their color correction tools, like DaVinci Resolve, for example, to be exactly the same as what Vantage will produce.
Excellent. Obviously, yeah, people trust these conversions and need to trust them. But, there's always trust issues. So when it comes to actually analyzing the content to make sure if it's correct, if it did this transition correctly, what do we have by way of tools to make sure everything came out okay in the end?
Well, that's a great question. So Vantage has a variety of analysis and QC functions. So we can analyze and insert static metadata for HDR10 content. Obviously, we can create HLG to and from any format, but HLG, as mentioned, has no dynamic metadata. We can extract and insert Dolby Vision metadata, including for IMF deliverables. So as I mentioned, people like Netflix are going to want to see an IMF package that's delivered with both embedded Dolby Vision metadata and probably a sidecar file as well. In addition, Telestream offers a variety of QC products that do all sorts of QC, including compliance and level checking. So both our VidChecker and Aurora products offer a variety of HDR tools, including IMF compliance from Photon. We should also mention that in addition to all the software solutions that Telestream offers for managing and creating HDR content, we are the industry leader for hardware monitoring and analysis with our Prism waveform monitor. The Prism waveform monitor can monitor up to 4 12G SDI connections or a 25G 2110. We'll suggest that you watch our Demystifying HDR in Post webinar. Questions?
All right. So now we'll open it up to questions. Feel free to type them into the Q&A box, and we'll try to field them live. All right. So we have a few questions in the chat here. And like I said, feel free to type any questions you may have. The first question we have here, Rob, what do you see as the main drivers of HDR technology in the coming few years? Is it the consumers, industry leaders, TV manufacturers, etc.?
I think it's all of those. Certainly the TV manufacturers are pushing the different technologies. There really isn't one consumer display manufacturer that offers all of these different HDR technologies. And of course, providers like Netflix, who are pushing, some standards over the others.
Great. Another question. Can old shows and movies that are shot in SDR, produced in SDR, be upconverted or remastered to HDR?
Yes, using our color space converter and the color conversion tools, whether it be the default ones or utilizing lookup tables, you can indeed remap your SDR content into an HDR color space in Gamut.
Excellent. What does Vantage give us that other tools do not?
Well, Vantage, for Vantage users, as you know, can automate complex tasks. And I think that's really the main feature you get utilizing Vantage over some of the other tools out there, is that we can automate these very complex conversions. Like you saw with the Fox Sports example, there is a whole lot of different information there, and that can be automated via the API. It can be automated via third-party applications like Premiere, or our workflow portals even. So we have a lot of ways to allow users to simplify and automate these really complicated workflows.
Great. And does Vantage support a wide range of LUTs, such as the BBC LUTs?
It does. As mentioned, we support the industry standard formats for lookup tables, so .cube and .3DL lookup tables, which pretty much covers all the different color correction tools out there. And this may segue into our next question. But yeah, so also proprietary LUTs that are available for purchase, such as the BBC LUTs, which are really popular. The BBC LUTs can drop right into Vantage, no problem.
Excellent. The next question, can Vantage Color Tools be integrated with Baselight systems?
Well, certainly we can utilize, again, the same type of lookup tables for conversions that are utilized in a Baselight system. So I didn't mention it by name, but Baselight also does utilize the same industry standard lookup table formats. So certainly if you're developing a proprietary look in your Baselight system using a lookup table, you can drop that lookup table into Vantage.
Perfect. Question about VidChecker. Does VidChecker produce a CIE chart analysis of the gamut of files?
I do not believe we produce a CIE chart output. We can measure in our various QC tools, whether it be VidChecker, Aurora, or Prism, we can measure things like the number of pixels that are in HDR space or pixels that are out of Gamut. That's a very good idea, though, that we'll pass along to our product manager for the QC products. I think that would be an interesting feature.
Agreed. Next question, does our SDR to HDR conversion do an intelligent content-based conversion, or is it just remapping?
Oh, that is a great question. It is, I mean, I guess it would depend on how you built it, but it is mostly just remapping into whatever your desired color space is, or in your desired transfer function. Again, though, with a lookup table, you could be doing, something maybe more complex or different than the default tools offer.
All right. And in terms of frame rates, what frame rates are usable with HDR content in Vantage?
Well, that would be somewhat codec dependent. Certainly up to 60 frames a second in every codec mentioned, HEVC, ProRes, JPEG 2000. And in some cases, we may be able to go beyond 60 frames a second, but certainly up to 60 frames a second, and resolutions up to at least 4K. And again, depending on format and codec, potentially even beyond 4K.
Absolutely. This next question is a good one, a little bit of a tricky question. Does Telestream have a product that can analyze a video file to identify whether or not it is HLG, considering that HLG has no metadata at all?
Yeah, that is a great question. And the answer is probably not, unless you knew what you were looking for. Right, if there were particular code. So we can analyze images and do all sorts of analysis of those images. So it would probably be a fairly tricky workflow, and you would need to know where in the content you would have to look for a particular code value that might not exist in an HLG. But no, great question, because HLG, the reason it is backwards compatible is because there isn't any metadata, right? It's essentially just a different gamma or transfer curve. So it would be content dependent and probably tricky. So yeah, the answer is it is a definite maybe.
Yeah. Great. Let's see, one of the last questions in the chat. Are we performing tone mapping for HDR to SDR conversions?
We are performing tone mapping if we utilize a LUT. And again, I think this would get to be very specific in terms of what formats we are going to and from.
Okay, one more question has popped into the chat. Do feel free to type them in if you have them. This one is in regards to formats. What formats support for Vantage to read HDR metadata from in terms of MP4, IMF, MXF, etc.?
So for embedded metadata, yeah, if it's static metadata in an MXF file or a QuickTime file, we can read that. We can extract Dolby Vision metadata from a Dolby Vision MXF file. So we could spend a lot of time on our Dolby Vision support, but we can certainly extract it from those formats. So anywhere that it is readable, whether it be information in the header, like static metadata in an HDR10 file, or dynamic metadata, like a Dolby Vision file.
Great. In terms of HDR10+, do we plan to support HDR10+ in the future? We do not support it currently.
Absolutely. Absolutely is on the roadmap. There has been less demand. So what's in the product today has been driven by the request of our customers. So to date, there has been less demand for HDR10+, but it is absolutely on the roadmap.
Perfect. Question about Dolby Vision. Is Dolby Vision HDR supported in a codec like XAVC Class 300 as a mezzanine file in Vantage?
Not currently. The only place it is supported is in an MXF OP1A file, and specifically today in our IMF encoder. I don't know that that would be impossible, but today it is really just MXF, and then we can also create MP4 HEVC files for consumer consumption. And the way the Dolby Vision metadata is stored in the MP4 HEVC is different than in the mezzanine MXF file. And we can only support it as a sidecar. So I should also mention that Dolby Vision metadata is often delivered as a sidecar XML, and we certainly can move that and apply that information wherever it's supported.
Great. One more question, and if you guys in the audience do have more questions, feel free to type them in. This last question we have in the queue, do you imagine greater use of HDR at 1080 or 4K resolutions?
Great question. Today, at least on the mezzanine side and the deliverable side to folks like Netflix, it's almost all UHD content. And of course, most of the displays you're going to go buy that are Dolby Vision or HDR10 capable today are 4K displays. Our customers, though, produce content in both, right? So whether it be 4K or 1080p, we can produce, and those are being produced currently in both formats today. But yes, HDR and Ultra HD or 4K seem to go hand in hand more so than HD. And again, mostly because a standard 1080p set probably doesn't support the HDR formats today. Not that they can't, they just may not.
Makes sense. Okay, let's see. Just saw another question pop into the chat. This is a question about ACES. Do we handle the ACES format?
We do not support ACES at the moment. That is a format that's commonly used in color correction and color management tools. Today, in terms of third-party integrations for color management, it would be .cube format LUTs or .3DL format LUTs. But great feature request.
Yes, it is. Good. Another question in the queue here. This is a good one. Because many HDR workflows are metadata dependent, is there now more robust metadata extraction support in Vantage? In the past, this has been a bit inconsistent.
Yeah, well, we have great metadata support in Vantage. So we have our metadata extractor, which can extract and manipulate JSON or XML input files. And we have the ability to use XSLT style sheets throughout the product for converting one type of metadata or XML format into another type. And in fact, I've been building workflows this week that do just that.
Yep, the extract action is extremely handy. Okay, those are all the questions in the chat, unless I see one pop in a moment. I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. It was a nice, concise webinar. Okay, very good. So if you want to reach out to us after this webinar, we will include our emails, and we also have a link to the Vantage processing platform if you are not familiar with it. And please do check out the other videos in our Disruptor webinar series. We'll have a link to them in this video. And again, this will be provided as an on-demand version in the next couple of days, and you should receive an email about it. Well, thank you everyone for your participation. A pleasure to have you all. And thank you, Rob. Great job.
You're very welcome. You guys all have a great day.